Back in 2022, I made a video talking about the fatal flaws of horror games. Honestly speaking, it was a one-off video that I didn't expect to take off. I was honestly expecting something like 50k views, and it'd be a one-and-done video. Well, that certainly took me by surprise. I've stated before that I love horror, but my channel isn't focused around it. But just because I don't publicly talk about the topics on this channel, that doesn't mean I don't keep up with the trends and don't play games in my free time.
We don't have time for that!
Most people wouldn't expect it, but as a YouTuber, I don't want to explicitly monetize every single aspect of my life. I do want to enjoy things just as regular old me. Maybe if I feel strong enough about a topic, I'll bring it up in an actual video, and I suppose that's why this video is being made right now. In the 2 years that video came out, more and more horror games have dropped, some being continuations of long-standing horror, others being brand new IPs that use horror as a part of its design philosophy, or have been a new chapter of a previously old game that I've criticized.
Oh no! Leave me! Please! Just go!
Ugh, nasty. I love it. So I think it's only natural to look back at some of my criticisms of the horror game genre, bring them up again, and see if they hold water, especially with some of the more notable examples that I myself have been experienced and seen in the last few years. Because I do think that horror games don't have to be stuck in the past, especially indie titles, and they don't need to be held back by the mistakes of their contemporaries. Still, before we start, two things. Stuff like controversies and...
But hey, that's just a theory. Again!
That will not be mentioned in this. And it should be noted that I might have some spoilers for the games in my footage, and since we are talking about horror games, there might be some disturbing imagery in the games I talk about. Especially... one of them. But then again, I'll be sure to give additional content warning for that one. With that, I'm MangaKamen, and it's terror time again, my friends.
Hi there, and welcome to Indigo Park! The world's most innovative and engaging family fun experience!
When it comes to indie horror, there's one sect of this type of gaming that I wish I could like, but oftentimes it gets watered down for a younger audience, and as such, some games come off as if they're the same formula with a different coat of paint and a different set of colorful characters to it. I understand that it's probably painting a very broad brushstroke, and I'm not going to say that it's the case for every member of the mascot horror genre. Hell, a game that I still don't particularly like, Poppy's Playtime, actually managed to surprise me with its latest chapter, as it did take a few pages out of actual horror and take risks with some of the scenes in its latest chapter. Still don't like it though. And then there's the whole Garden of Bonbon. God, that was a trip and a half. But convenient segues aside, that's actually bringing us to our latest hot game in mascot horror.
My leg!
Hi, I'm Rambly the Raccoon.
Indigo Park. I want to make it clear that as a game that is not only free to play, not only the first serious project made by a fellow content creator, Unique Geese, who apparently went to the same convention I went to a few weeks ago, I can see a lot of passion put into this game. The fact that there's stuff like the animation of Rambly the Raccoon, and no, I'm not saying that because I have my own raccoon-like character, the fact that the creator had evolved his project from a challenge week, there's a lot of heart and soul put into the game. So when I make my criticisms of it, note they don't come from a place of malice, they come from a place of genuine affection. There are things like glitches and bugs, but I'm not going to hold that over the game's head since it's the first time project. The game itself features the most important person in the world. Ed! Yes, Ed! A faceless explorer who's the thrill seeker who explores places and posts it online. Other than that, we don't really get a lot about our protagonist, other than his partner in crime, Laura, doesn't want to go with him. At least that's something, more than I can say for some other games, especially in the horror genre. That said, I don't really care for a lot of the choices in the game's design. One of the biggest things I don't really care for is the walking simulator-esque design philosophy, especially with a lack of actual, gameplay. I understand that having a first-person point of view is standard fare, especially for horror games, and there's a lot to be said for immersion's sake with this style, but it doesn't help it stand out from the other horror games that use similar design philosophies. Though the location is different, a theme park as to oppose the Pizzaplex from Security Breach is essentially the same idea in that regard, and there are other horror games that take place in theme parks. Evil mascots, employees murdered by said mascots, unable to actually fight back, and of course, running away from one of the evil mascots. The game works, but I felt as though when I was playing the game, it lacked a mind of game design or even horror design, because frankly speaking, I didn't really find the game all that scary or enthralling, unless you were talking to Rambly. Let's take the first actual chase scene, the one with Molly Macaw. There was some build up to the character. One of the most prominent parts is when you sometimes see the mascot on the camera snapshots after you take the train ride, or when you actually get out of Lloyd's backstage, you see her head poking out looking at you. Menacingly. But the problem with that is that there isn't actually anything threatening about the monster chasing us. We have no real reason to be afraid of Molly. Yes, she is stalking us, but the game doesn't really give us a reason why we can't just use our flashlight to attack this monster. Let's do a comparison to one of gaming's best chasers, and one of the first ones as well. Nemesis from Resident Evil. Even in his introductory cutscene, we're actually given a reason to get away from Nemesis. We see him kill someone right in front of us. He has this superhuman strength, not only capable of lifting a full-grown man with one hand and using a tentacle to kill the same grown man rather easily. This establishes that the monster's a threat, that he's willing to kill, and he's got his sights set on us next. Run away! Molly Macaw doesn't really do that. Maybe if we saw some remains of some of her victims, or even a scene where she attacks Lloyd the lion, that would establish her as a proper threat. And this is probably just a me thing, but I've never really been a fan of first-person chases like this, since there really isn't a grasp of how close the chaser is behind me. Sometimes it makes me feel like I'm the Flash, and I lost the monster in the maze I'm in. Could have done something like having a diegetic song playing during the chase. Something that gets louder and louder as the chaser gets closer and closer. But we get this fast-paced chase music which, while fine on its own, doesn't really add to the fear factor. Hell, Molly's monster design isn't even that scary if I'm honest. The idea of mascot horror is to take something innocent and corrupt it, but again, I don't see the fear factor of her. Then there's level design. If anything, it's basically on the rails, which for a theme park is kind of ironic. There isn't any suspense, and that really hurts the atmosphere. We're supposed to be an amusement park that's designed for kids. There should be a lot more colors for the majority of the park, more specifically the in-between parts. I think the part that I kinda have issue with is ironically enough probably the internet's favorite scene. The train scene that basically railroads you into learning most of the characters, save for Salem the Skunk, who actually has an interesting introduction in the optional arcade segment, and it doesn't actually put you on the rails to meet her. The other characters don't really have a good setup. Rambly as a character is memorable, but that's due to the fact that we spend most of the time with him, as he's an AI who appears on every screen in the park. But the other characters, well, the most we get is Rambly doesn't really like Lloyd, Molly crashes her plane a lot, and I kinda forgot what the sea serpent's name was, sorry. It's obvious that these characters are set to have personality when it comes to their monster forms. We don't really see that though. We see the cartoon characterization, but not the actual monsters, especially since Molly Macaw gets killed off in the first chapter. There was meat in there? I'm not trying to say, oh, this game is bad, but for what is essentially the hot new item on the mascot horror list, it leaves a lot to be desired. Aside from the animation and character designs, there's not much to really push it apart from other horror games. And hey, the character designs are great. Even someone as hard-headed as me can tell that the internet has fallen in love with these characters. I hope that when Chapter 2 comes out, there will be improvements on the gameplay, design work, and getting a few more hands on the project. I mean, the Kickstarter managed to raise more than $250,000. So, here's hoping. And I'm glad there's success, but I hope that when Chapter 2 drops, they really make a great project. Because while there was potential in Chapter 1, it's rather messy as a horror game and lacks any real game direction in it. At least in my humble opinion.
With the natural order!
There's something to be said when it comes to indie games, especially horror indie games. They're not stringent to the AAA trends, and they don't have to have the biggest and best graphics. And if I'm honest, I'm kinda getting tired of seeing ultra-realistic graphics in games. I grew up in the PS1 era. Whether that tells you what Stone Age I'm from or not, well, mystery is the spice of life, my friends. But I'm one of the many who grew up with the graphics that evolved from small bits to full-on polygons and gone to today where games are almost real life. And maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's me becoming a fossil, or maybe it's because I just have a preference for the classic graphics of things like Final Fantasy VII, Silent Hill, or even Brave Fencer Musashi.
Take that back, you little turd!
Please, princess, so little turd, calmeth down.
But I find that games like this lend themselves to be great in prime horror material. You don't need the best graphics to make an outstanding horror game. Just look towards Faith, a game that essentially emulates the Atari games and still manages to become a terrifying experience because the atmosphere and what the developers are willing to do, pushing the art style to its limits. And as such, let's talk about Crow Country. Now this is something I love. Aesthetically, this is my jam. While it isn't exactly what I was talking about, the blocky look certainly caught my attention for the game. Thank you, SPF Games. You play as a girl named Mara, a girl who makes it clear that her name is Mara Forrest. And she's on her way to Crow Country, a closed-down amusement park back in the year of 1990, on the search for the park's owner, Mr. Crow. Instantly, I'm hooked with the premise, the artistic design, and the mystery. And that's really the best way to get people into a game, especially horror-based. You need to put some bait out there to the audience, and when it comes to horror games, you also need to do that with the main character. Mara, already using a fake name, says a fair bit about the character that she's hiding something and she's not what she seems. Even to us, the players, who control her. It reminds me of James from Silent Hill 2, where the character was just as big a mystery as the place we're going to. I make the comparison to Silent Hill 2, but Crow Country has more of a resemblance to Resident Evil, and not just with the graphics, but with the camera and tank controls. The only difference is you can actually move the camera, and when you aim your gun in the game, you can actually move your aim in various directions. You've also got the stuff of survival horror where you have to choose what to do and what resources you want to use. I will point out initially, I found the game to be a bit too easy, since the game would give you quite a bit of items from trash cans, breaking boxes, and vending machines, so the item economy would be a bit too lax for my tastes.
That was easy.
When survival horror is the genre you're going for, it's best to make sure that you put your players in situations where they need to choose to run, fight, or anything else, and sometimes make it so they have to take into account whether or not they want to waste their bullets on enemies that can take a lot of damage. Still, I say this was an initial criticism that I had. The developers at the time of me scripting this video have already provided a hard mode, the Murder of Crows mode. It makes the enemies a lot more aggressive and chase after you more, and there's also the removal of hints to the game's puzzles. And of course, making items a lot more scarce. Plus, you don't have the infinite ammo that's in your trunk. At least I think so. It's something that got the inner masochist that haunts my brains at night waking up. In a good way, I think. I don't know. Crow Country is actually an interesting beast when it comes to its gameplay, since it takes a lot more modern spin on the tank controls. Heck, I'd even say that it reminds me of the classic Mega Man Legends games with controls too. Aside from the difficulty aspect that was addressed before this video came out, the only other critique I would have is that the story gets a massive dump at the end of the game. Obviously, I'm not going into the story of Crow Country because, while I do have my criticisms of it, I think it's a good enough story regardless, and it's best to experience in the game and come to your own conclusion. I don't think it's a super deep criticism, more of a preference for me, but still felt it was necessary to bring up. So yeah, I think Crow Country is a great horror game. It's a game that managed to capture the atmosphere of when I used to play Resident Evil many years ago, and playing the game on the Murder of Crows difficulty really gave me a great vibe of survival horror. And I don't know, in comparison to say Indigo Park, which has the elements of the dreaded walking simulator, Crow Country manages to check a number of marks for what I think is a great horror game. And while I'm not for the idea of there being an exploration mode, I can understand wanting to make a creepy puzzle adventure for some people. Still, I'm thankful for any modern horror game that doesn't have the same walking simulator design philosophy and really takes nostalgic game elements and makes something really special and unique. I think to round out this video, I want to talk a bit about RPG Maker. For decades, the little program has proven to be able to create a ton of interesting games, especially for the horror genre. Hell, I'm pretty sure one of the earliest games that got me interested in horror for games was an RPG Maker. I think it was Ebe. And even to this very day, we've got a ton of other RPG Maker horror games, some of which are extremely creative and in all honesty deserve their own videos that I may or may not talk about sometime this year. I don't know, if anyone wants me to talk about them in more detail, let me know in the comments down below and leave a like. 5k likes and we'll get there, blah 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 blah. So what does RPG Maker have to do with this? And which of the many games are we going to talk about? Well... I'm pretty sure I can't show a majority of that on YouTube, but yes, in 2018, the world was introduced the original Fear and Hunger, an RPG Maker horror game that has combat mechanics and it's similar to other role-playing games. It was a gruesome game that loved to kick your teeth in with its heavy subject matter, hair-tearing difficulty, and of course, the disturbing pixel art that the game had. And it was pretty much made by one person, and you've got an indie game that really catches your attention. Of course, the game I really want to talk about is the sequel, Fear and Hunger 2: Termina. It's actually the game I would recommend people who are looking to get into the series, since while the game is still hard, it's still got a lot more polish to it, and in my experience, it's probably the better of the two games to adapt to, especially for newcomers. Then again, this game was also all over YouTube last year with people talking about it, so there you go. I do need to stress that some of these games are not for everyone. I mean, anyone can play them, sure, but the games are extremely mature and will cover sensitive topics and have disturbing imagery in it. And while I'm sure my editor will not be putting in that stuff in this section of the video, I need to express that this game really is not for the faint of heart, and you need to have a bit of an iron stomach. Not just for the story beats, but also for the art in the game as well. Fear and Hunger 2 is probably what I look for in a horror game as a game, and even more so as an RPG. Not only do you have a ton of characters to play as in the game, but you can also recruit or attack the other characters too. That alone is enough to get a ton of replay value added to the game, which, not for naught, is something that a lot of horror games don't really offer in that regard. One of the elements of horror that is kind of a detriment to the genre is that once you experience something, the more you experience it, the more familiar you get with it, and thus killing the horror of the game. It's when I'm playing a game like Outlast or Outlast 2, games that sometimes rely on trial and error, and in that case, also make your experience a lot more frustrating than frightening. I don't really get that with Fear and Hunger 2. I think it's because of the RPG elements which allow you to explore and combat the threats in different ways if you fail. And the characters help with that, as each of them have their own elements and advantages to them. For example, Marco, who was an underground boxer, has a double attack if he doesn't have weapons equipped. And who doesn't love the idea of kicking Eldritch Abomination ass with your bare hands? Also, he's explicitly a JoJo reference, and that's actually stated by the official YouTube channel here, so that makes me want to use the character as an example more. Yada yada daze. Now, some abilities you can only get if you start with a character, and other characters will have abilities that can be useful if you recruit them. Like, if you get Karen, she has the ability to lockpick doors. This is also glossing over the character history choices for each of the playable characters, as each of them can have chosen histories that can give them items and skills. Like with Karen, depending on your choices, she can get a friggin' gun! And guns are good in this game, like, really good. Listen, where are things like a giant freak of nature with a frickin' cannon sticking out of its face? You need everything you can get to fight that bastard! So we've established that the one thing that I really like about this horror game is the amount of choices that can allow the players to really get the most out of this game and experiment with different builds, team compositions, and even events in the games based on their actions. There's also a bit of randomness added to the game as well, and I'm not just talking about the game's coin mechanic that pops up when you open chests where you fail to get nothing, or the game's bosses where if you fail there's a good chance you'll be killed. No, it's more or less the events that you can come across as well as when you visit certain areas. I'm trying my best not to spoil a lot in this game because, honestly speaking, it's a game where it's best to go in blind. Well, I mean, as long as you're okay with disturbing imagery. But I want to give an example that I've seen a lot of other essayists bring up because it happens so early in the game. So in the town you explore, roughly in the northwest, you'll come across some tunnels, and in these tunnels you'll come across, well, first a murderous clown that kills one of the NPCs, but also a powerful enemy called Changer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. This oddly muscular monster with an elephant-like face dressed in what appears to be yellow overalls. After performing a rendition of the Kool-Aid Man,
Oh yeah!
it'll come after you and attack. But after you beat the monster in combat, or by shooting the damn thing, you essentially get a soul. In gameplay turns, you open up a new skill tree to develop, something that only player characters get. You get what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm getting at? Can you see the writing on the wall? That monster Changa? That was a playable character. A Bella to be precise. Now, this is Fear and Hunger 2 has a scheduling. Whatever characters you didn't choose to be your playable character will be NPCs who have their own goals and such. And depending on what you do and when you do it, the NPCs will do different things. And Abella here is one example, as she's one of the first characters who become moon-scorched, which is basically turning into a monster in the game. On a mechanic-wise, I enjoy this as a game. I wish more horror games had this level of thought put into them so they can be actual games. If I'm completely honest, Fear and Hunger 2 reminds me of the first few Dead Rising games, and even Majora's Mask. They too operate on scheduling events with NPCs in order to succeed the quest that the game gave you so you can get other advantages in the game, putting stress on the player in different ways. Also, there's a giant moon in Majora's Mask, there's one in Fear and Hunger 2 Termina, both with freaky faces, and also Termina is the name of the world in Majora's Mask. God, that is clicking a lot in my brain right now, and I love it. There are a ton of other elements to this game that I haven't gone into, like how limbs can be removed for both enemies and characters. So if you lose your legs, you actually have to crawl on your belly in the overworld. You see, if there's one thing I would actually like to see horror games be, is that they be actually games. Like, one of my biggest issues with some horror games is that their gameplay is essentially, go to place, you are blocked, go to find thing to unblock path, and do it all over again. And the only thing that really differentiates that is the story and wrapping. Now, I realize that's grossly general, and I don't even think that's really appropriate to say to some games in the last few years. Hell, Hobby Playtime, a game that I still have issues with, did change things up with its gameplay with the grab pack. But with something like Fear and Hunger 2, it really stands out with its gameplay from other horror games, where it takes a spin on the traditional RPG mechanics and blends it into a horrifying world. Again, I need to stress that there is a lot of disturbing, mature, and sensitive material in this game, so if you are interested, please be sure to prepare yourself with this one. Same with its first game, which admittedly is worse in that regard. There is apparently a misconception about me. Throw it onto the pile, I guess, that I apparently hate indie horror games. I've seen a couple people say that online. Then again, people do crazy things and don't really know my opinions since they don't actually watch my videos. I do want to point out that I do not hate indie horror games, but we do need to admit that there are a lot of games that do follow the trends of the time. This was something that was apparent back in the day when people would make those Slenderman games just so they get highlighted by YouTubers. Do I think there are bad horror games out there? Yeah, obviously. Like, just between us, I believe that the Silent Hill 2 remake is going to be an uphill battle for me to enjoy. Not because I'm getting tired of remakes or I'm a snob for the original, it's because it's being developed by Bloober Team, a gaming company that I honestly hate. But my annoyance with this company is far more than what this video is about. All art, including horror games, owes to the work that comes before it. Nothing is 100% original, and taking pre-existing ideas from other stories, games, or whatever and throwing into a blender is a great way to be creative. Hell, throughout this video I had made comparisons to the main topics here to games that shared similar elements that I enjoyed, sometimes with critique and sometimes to show, hey, this is neat. It's just to me that sometimes there are games that don't really understand what elements make to make a good, memorable horror game, and I specifically mean horror games in this instant. I like to think that I was actually quite positive in this video. We need to remember that horror games are games first and horror second. You can have the scariest monsters, the most thought-provoking story, but if you showcase them as the same as everyone else, it's not really going to matter. I suppose this is because when I play games, I tend to think of them as games first and foremost. I want the experience to be enjoyable and fun, and sometimes when mixed with horror, that can be a tall order. After all, the goal of horror is to make your audience scared or have them leave with a bone-chilling thought. But unlike horror movies, games have the interactive aspect, obviously, and gameplay for horror games should be considered, and I will say that I do appreciate that there are games out there that do consider the gameplay aspect. Hell, there are other horror games out there that I didn't bring up that came out in the time since I made my original video, Signalis being one of those that came out almost immediately afterwards. I do believe that horror games, whether they be indie or mainstream, are getting better, but I'm holding my breath because there will probably be another trend that'll crop up and the cycle will begin again. Oh well. In any case, if you enjoyed the video, please let me know what horror games you love and hate down below in the comments. Always looking for new games to play and explore, even the bad ones. I'm MangaKamen, and thank you for watching.